1979 was a lot like 2020. We had a lot of meltdowns, a lot of fallout. Alright, welcome back. My favorite albums year by year. 1979 was probably pretty close to the pinnacle of disco, as evident by Herbie Hancock, Kiss, among others, dipping their toe into the pool. Well, let's look at some of the other stuff, shall we? Scorpions came out with Love Drive. This is when they really started to take off. A lot of people think that's kind of the pinnacle of the Scorpions' early sound. I tend to agree. Some good stuff on that album. Accept put out their first album. Sister Sledge, We Are Family. Generation X was kicking it still. That was Billy Idol and Tony, what's his name? I'll probably put it down there. Black Flag put out an EP this year. Def Leppard put out an EP, their first thing. The Babies put out Head First. Had that song Every Time I Think of You. I love John Waite singing. This album, not so strong for me. It had some, lyrically speaking, some not so great stuff, but his singing has always been spot on for me. Bee Gees were still getting it. Cheap Trick live at Budokan. I listened to this album a whole lot back in this year, and 79, 80, and it just doesn't hold up for me. There's some moments on there that are pretty cool. Love Rick Nielsen's guitar playing, but overall the album doesn't hold up as well as some others have. But it's a classic album. The Allman Brothers came back together after a several year split with Enlightened Rogues. Not their strongest album stuff, but still some good stuff on there. Zappa put out a bunch of stuff this year. I'll get to that in a minute. One of them was Chic Your Booty, which is a great title for an album, as always, from Frank Zappa. Bad Company put out Desolation Angels. This is their 5th album. It had Rock and Roll Fantasy, Gone, Gone, Gone. Some other good stuff on there. It was in March. Van Halen came out with their follow-up to their massive debut album, Van Halen 2. It's another good time party album. It's got some good stuff on it. You're No Good cover song, Linda Ronstadt song. Put their own twist on that. Dance the Night Away, Somebody Get Me a Doctor, Bottoms Up, Spanish Fly, DOA, Women in Love, Beautiful Girls. Another classic Van Halen album. Their first 4 were really the era of David Lee Roth that I really like. Motorhead put out Overkill. It was the first thing I ever heard by Motorhead. A friend of mine in high school was really big into Motorhead. This would have been in 81, so the year after, a couple of years after this came out, and he let me borrow a cassette tape. I listened to it, and I was into other stuff at the time. I was getting into new wave kind of stuff, punk stuff. I was into Pink Floyd pretty heavy at that time. Still a Kiss fan at that time, and this just didn't do much for me. Later on, when Lemmy died, I delved back into the Motorhead catalog, feet first, and I can really say that I'm a big Motorhead fan. They had some great stuff, including this album, but at the time it didn't stick with me. Supertramp put out the enormously successful Breakfast in America. It's got some great songs on it. It's a really good album. Breakfast in America. Journey put out Evolution. I think this was their 5th album, I think. Had Majestic, the instrumental, Too Late, Lovin', Touchin', Squeezin', City of the Angels, Just the Same Way, Lady Luck. It had some good stuff on it. Not my favorite thing by Journey, but it had some good stuff on it. Can't get through 79 without mentioning this album. We had this album in my house. I don't recall who bought it. It wasn't, but I definitely listened to it. This was Donna Summer's Bad Girls. This was an absolutely huge album. It set all kind of records. Had a number of firsts on it as far as female singers and charts and things like that. It was an absolutely huge album. Emmylou put out Blue Kentucky Girl, another great album from her. Blackfoot put out Strikes, good album. Kiss put out Dynasty. This was at the period when the band was literally falling apart. There's only one song on this entire album that Peter Criss actually played drums on it. Anton Fig, probably most popularly known as the drummer from David Letterman's band, Paul Schaefer, Anton Fig, Will Lee. It had a couple of good songs on it. My favorite stuff off that album are the 3 Ace Frehley songs by far. He seemed to be the one that was the most creative and productive at that point in the band. I saw them live this year. ELO put out Discovery. Pretty decent album, not my favorite from them. Peter Green returned from obscurity and put out In the Skies. This was the first thing he had done in probably, I don't know, 6 or 7 years or something like that. It's got some good stuff on it, in my opinion. Kansas put out Monolith. It's got Song for America. It's probably the biggest song from that album. They shot a video for one of the songs on this album. In my hometown, we have an area called the Three Caves, and I don't know how they found out about it. They did a couple of things in Huntsville, and there were a couple of bands that shot videos in Huntsville over the years. Forerunner did one for I Want to Know What Love Is. But they did a video shoot there. They played this year. I think I saw them, I think 79 was the year I saw them first. But yeah, that album's got some good stuff on it. Ted Nugent put out State of Shock. Wings put out their last album, which was oddly enough titled Back to the Egg, and then they disappeared and Paul McCartney became the solo monster that he became. The Who put out the Kids Are Alright soundtrack. Alright, this album deserves a little mention. It was Get the Knack by The Knack. It was their debut album, and this thing took off and was pretty popular during the disco era, and it was just straight ahead, high energy pop rock. Some good stuff on this album. The Knack is overlooked, but there is some good stuff on this album. Good Girls Don't is on this album. My Sharona is on this album, which has some killer guitar playing on it. Everybody just typically remembers, My Sharona, but the guitar solo in that song just rips. Yeah, Get the Knack. That was a good album. You should go listen to that if you've never heard the whole thing, just to get kind of a picture of what the Knack were about. That's a good picture of it. Who else came out with something this year? The Cars put out their second album, Candy-O. Not as big as their first album, I don't think. It had Let's Go, It's All I Can Do, Candy-O, Night Spots. It had some good stuff on it. So I think their first album was far better than this one. And they would do other albums that were better than this one, but it was a good album. Kind of rushing through this because there's one album I want to talk about. Queen put out a Live Killers. Mick Taylor put out a solo album this year. Some good stuff on there. Always loved Mick Taylor. Jerry Rafferty put out his follow-up to City called Night Owl. There's some good stuff on that album. A band called Samson put out their first album. That was the Bruce Dickinson band before he joined Iron Maiden. He didn't actually sing on this album, but he's on it. He's on the cover. They did put out a follow-up EP or a live something that was done, and he sang on, I think, 3 or 4 songs on that. Neil Young put out Rust Never Sleeps, live album with Crazy Horse. It's a good one. It's got My My Hey Hey. Starts with that and ends with Hey Hey My My. So it's kind of 2 different takes on that song. It's got Powderfinger on it. Great song. Welfare Mothers. Some good stuff on that album. I like Neil Young's rockin' version live. He does some interesting stuff, in my opinion. It almost sounds like live he creates an album that sounds like Phil Spector produces. This is wall of noise. But I generally like his live stuff. B-52's debuted. Acdc, Highway to Hell, the pinnacle of Acdc for me. You could separate it into the Bon Scott years and the Brian Johnson years, and you would have, Back in Black and stuff like that. But Highway to Hell to me is definitely my favorite album from them. It's got that song, Girls Got Rhythm, Walk All Over You, Touch Too Much, Beating Around the Bush, Shot Down in Flames, Get It Hot, Want Blood, You've Got It, Love Hungry Man, and the killer Night Prowler to close that album out. Starts out with probably my favorite song by them, or it's up there, Highway to Hell, and ends with Night Prowler. Just a killer song. Great way to bookend an album. And Bon Scott would pass away about 6 months later, and then they would come back with probably the best comeback album that was ever recorded. I'm sure we'll talk about that. Rainbow put out Down to Earth. Ry Cooder put out an album called Bop Till You Drop. The music on it is okay. There's some good stuff on there. Probably one of my favorite songs on there is Down in Hollywood. But it was notable for being the first mainstream album, rock, pop type stuff. I believe there was some classical stuff that was put out and possibly some jazz that was put out. But it was the first mainstream album that was totally digital, recorded digitally, mixed digitally, and mastered digitally. And I bought it specifically for that reason. When I had learned about it, this was several years later. And I enjoy that album. It's got some good stuff on it. Devo put out their follow-up, Duty Now for the Future. Not their best work. I don't think it was as strong as the first one, but it's got some cool stuff on it. Devo Corporate Anthem, Clock Out, Blockhead, SIB, Secret Agent Man, Smart Patrol, Mr. DNA. That's a good song. I just love those guys. But yeah, I think they were kind of an enigma in the music world. Didn't get the credit they deserved, I don't think. I think eventually people started realizing what it was they were doing. But Yeah, they had some good stuff. I was really big into Devo in high school. Little River Band put out First Under the Wire. It was their 5th album. This album has Lonesome Loser, Cool Change, and a lot of other good songs, but those 2 songs are seriously good songs. Cool Change is probably one of my favorites of that genre. Some good stuff on that album. Little River Band's Greatest Hits is one of my favorite Greatest Hits packages because it's just full of good stuff. We had the Talking Heads came out with their follow-up to their debut, Fear of Music. Their first 4 albums are all really, really good to me. They didn't have a long career, but their early stuff before they took a break was just unique and solid. They had some great stuff. Fear of Music, actually it's their 3rd album. I misspoke. It had Life During Wartime. It had a song called Izimbra, which had some cool rhythmic stuff going in it, kind of Afro-Cuban kind of stuff going on. A song called Cities. It's a really, really good album. Definitely. I would suggest you give that one a shot if you've never heard it. Go back to my 78 video and read the comment that PT Daily put up. He talked about the Talking Heads, and he had a really good description of what the Talking Heads were about. Go check that out. Michael Jackson exploded onto the scene with Off the Wall. He hit at the perfect time, I think, when disco was it was still kind of hitting its peak, and it was just about to go into the 80s, and he absolutely ruled in the 80s. Off the Wall, it's a good album if you're into that style of music. It had some good stuff on it. Let me click on that, look at the song list. Yeah, I think it had 5 really high charting singles on it. Don't Stop Till You Get Enough, Rock With You, Off the Wall, Girlfriend, She's Out of My Life. Yeah, it was a big album, and he would follow that up with an absolute monster album. Bob Dylan became a Christian, put out Slow Train Coming. This is regarded as one of the best Christian albums ever put out. Lost him a lot of fans and also gained him a lot of fans. It had the big song off there was probably Gotta Serve Somebody. Not my favorite Dylan stuff, but a unique album, I think. Zeppelin put out In Through the Outdoor, which was their last album their last album. There was something that came out after they broke up, but In the Evening, Fool in the Rain, All My Love, those were probably the biggest hits off that, or most well-known songs. There's some stuff on here that I just don't care for. And overall, I don't know. It's definitely not the strongest Zeppelin album in my opinion. I like their more bluesy rockin' stuff, and this was getting into lounge singer territory in some instances, and I didn't care for it. This was a really good picture of what Robert Plant's solo career would go on to be. It's definitely, he had some serious influence on that album. Pat Benatar put out In the Heat of the Night. Gary Newman put out The Pleasure Principle. Jethro Tull put out their final song in their folk rock trilogy kind of thing, Stormwatch. It had some good stuff on it. Frank Zappa put out the record company, I don't know how it worked out, but he put out an album called Joe's Garage, and it was 3 acts, so Act 1, 2, and 3. They released Act 1 first, and then they released the whole package later. That is probably, to me, his magnum opus type album. It's definitely not for everybody. It's a concept album. It's got characters that pop up in it, sung by different people and stuff like this. It's some good Zappa. Definitely some good Zappa. Judas Priest put out their first live album, Unleashed in the East. That's a pretty good album. Some pretty good stuff on that. Cheap Trick put out Dream Police. U2 put out their first thing. It was an EP. The Eagles, like Led Zeppelin, came to the end of their career. They would turn it back up for cash later on, but they put out The Long Run, and although it's got some good songs on it, there's some good stuff on it, it's very, very polished, and that's not what I enjoy about the Eagles so much, and therefore it's not my favorite stuff by them. But I'm not denying there's some good songs on there. Santana put out Marathon. The Police put out their second album, Regatta De Blanc. It had Message in a Bottle, Regatta De Blanc, Bring on the Night, Walking on the Moon. Really interesting song. The Bed's Too Big Without You. There's some good stuff on this album as well. I really enjoyed the early Police stuff. And they had such a small career. I mean, when it gets right down to it, I think they only put out 4 or 5 albums, I think. I don't remember. I think it was 5, but it was a very short run for a very good band. I think Sting got too big, too popular, and that's what tore them apart. I don't know that for a fact, but let's see here. Fleetwood Mac put out an album called Tusk, a very ambitious, different, very Lindsey Buckingham project type album. It had all kinds of different stuff on it, and my brother loved this album. I didn't. There were a few songs on it that I thought were pretty cool, but overall it seemed like it was very I don't know, when you think of a self-indulgent type album, it seemed like that to me. It just didn't play well for me. So there's that. Styx put out their 9th album, Cornerstone. This one had Lights, Why Me, Babe. Had some good Tommy Shaw songs on it. Never Say Never, Boat on a River, Love in the Midnight. They had kind of peaked for me. This was the last of their, I won't say that, it wasn't their last, but it was they were coming to an end of an era, the style of music they were playing, and this one was kind of an in-between of where they had come from and where they were going. And it's not my favorite, but they can't all be my favorites. Sorry, Tommy. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers put out their 3rd album, Damn the Torpedoes, and it had some good stuff on it. Refugee, Here Comes My Girl, Even the Losers, Shadow of a Doubt, Don't Do Me Like That, What Are You Doing in My Life, Louisiana Rain. It's some good classic Tom Petty. He never really put anything out that I didn't like. I mean, even some of his solo stuff without the Heartbreakers that he did, the Mud Crutch stuff, the Traveling Wilburys, pretty much anything he was associated with I liked. Just always been a big Tom Petty fan, and that's a good album. Damn the Torpedoes. Motorhead also put out Bomber this year. This was their second and third album, however you want to look at it. They put out they recorded an album back in 76, 77 that got shelved. And when they put out their first two albums, they started getting a little popularity. The record company released that against their wishes. So this was the second one that they consider their second album. It's called Bomber. That was the big song off of it as far as, I think, releases. Dead Men Tell No Tales is on here. Sharpshooter. All the Aces. Yeah, there's some good stuff on this album. Really like Motorhead. Molly Hatchet put out their second album, Flirting with Disaster. Again, there's some okay stuff on it. I'm not the biggest Molly Hatchet fan in the world, but there's some good stuff on there. Toto put out their third album called Hydra. It's got some great stuff on it. Band I mentioned a few minutes ago put out an EP this year. Very highly sought after EP called the Soundhouse Tapes. Iron Maiden. This was pre-Bruce Dickinson, pre-Adrian Harris, pre-Nico McBain. This was basically Steve Harris and Dave Murray. They were the core of this band. They were just really getting started. They'd been doing stuff for quite a few years, but they finally managed to get a coherent band together and put out something. I can't say that I've ever heard the Soundhouse Tapes as one thing. I've heard all three of the songs that are on it, but they got re-recorded for their first album. The songs that are on this were Iron Maiden, Invasion, and Prowler. Had Paul Diano on vocals. A guy named Paul Cairns played guitar. Doug Sampson was on drums still. So yeah, they went through a few more changes before their classic Maiden lineup got set in stone. But yeah, that was them sticking their head out of the sand, saying, "Look out, we're coming."
And boy, did they.
Aerosmith put out a Night in the Ruts. This was they were having some ego issues in the band. Not long after this came out, on the tour, I think, Joe Perry quit the band. Not my favorite Aerosmith album by any means. Probably my least favorite Aerosmith album of the early stuff, but ZZ Top put out Deguello. It's their sixth album. It had I Thank You, I'm Bad, I'm Nationwide, Dust My Broom, Cheap Sunglasses. Killer stuff on this album. You've heard me say it a few times, but their first 6, 7 albums were just monstrous to me. Love that version of the band. When they hit MTV, I mean, I like their stuff okay, and I like some of their more recent stuff, but that really popular era for them, I didn't care for that much. Little Feat put out their last album. Lowell George put out a solo album this year as well, and he would die not too long after that. But Yeah, that was the end of Little Feat. Well, the end of that. They would reform, put it that way. The Clash put out London Calling, a monstrous album in that genre. It's a double album. It's got all kinds of good stuff on it. London Calling's on there. Train in Vain, probably one of their more popular songs. It's got some good stuff on it. I was into the Clash at one point, but their stuff doesn't hold up as well to me as some other stuff from that era, from that genre. Alright, so that's almost everything that came out that year. There's one other. It's by Pink Floyd. It's called The Wall. This is my choice for my favorite album from this year. It really came down to this and Highway to Hell. And when I put them side by side and think about the history of how I've interacted with these albums and how much enjoyment I've gotten out of them, The Wall is undeniably my favorite. It's probably my favorite album ever. That's saying a lot, but it's yeah, I can't think of one right off the top of my head that would top it without sitting down and doing a serious examination of something. But yeah, I just absolutely love this album. You've heard it, more than likely. Double album, concept album. It was Roger Waters', he came up with the concept of this album on the Animals tour, and it was kind of a disdain for the way the fans were reacting or treating the band, or I don't know what he was thinking when he wrote it. Roger Waters is a strange individual, in my opinion, but he can write some great music. He can sing with some serious passion and emotion, and that stuff is all over this album. David Gilmour's playing on this album is just stellar. The whole band is, really. But I don't know how many times I've listened to this album, but it's one of those where I feel like I know every little thing that's coming. You know, wait for this sound, wait for that sound. All the background noises, all the weird stuff that's going on. The movie that went along with it just adds so much to this album and your understanding of what this album is about. And it's just an absolute classic album. Some of my favorite single songs off of here, outside the context of the album itself. The Another Brick in the Wall, there's 3 of those on there, part 1, 2, and 3. Most everybody knows the We Don't Need No Education. That's part 2. 1 and 3 are really good to me, in addition to that one. Mother, love that song. Goodbye Blue Skies. Hey You. Is There Anybody Out There? Into Nobody's Home. Vera. Comfortably Numb. In the Flesh. Run Like Hell. The Trial. That's such a classic song. Yeah, but I mean, there's songs on here like Bring the Boys Back Home. Like this, classic choir or something with all this orchestration going on in the background. There have been times I've been driving down the road with this album just absolutely cranked up and got some of the weirdest looks in the world listening to some of these songs. But the album as a whole, I mean, there are individual songs on it that are great, but the album as a whole, a complete thought, is nothing tops it for me. It's just a fantastic thing. I've listened to interviews, I've read detailed reviews on what the album's about. I've listened to different people talk about it. I mean, everything I could get my hands on about this album, I tried to absorb it. There's some great stuff on it. I remember the first time I heard it, I was a freshman in high school, so it was about 18 months after it came out. And I had a cassette tape of the Clash, Combat Rock, on my little Walkman. And my buddy had his Walkman at school, and he had The Wall. He was a huge Clash fan, and he had not heard that album yet. It had just come out. And he asked me if I wanted to trade. Not for good, just for the day, so we could each listen to the other one. I said, yeah. And I probably never heard any Pink Floyd besides what was on the radio. And I put on that album, and it was just like, what in the world is this? I mean, I remember hearing like Gomer Pyle in the background and stuff, and going, this is weird, man. It was probably 3 years later when I actually purchased a copy of that album, got into it, and really, really dug into it. I had a friend that was really, really into that album as well, and we would sit there and listen to it just over and over and dissect all this stuff. We learned to play about probably half the songs on the album. I remember once sitting down with my acoustic guitar and playing along with the album, the whole thing. And, I couldn't play it perfectly, obviously, but a lot of it I knew so well that I could keep up with it. It's one of those albums that I have absolutely absorbed over the years. It's just classic album. I can't say enough about it. It's my favorite thing ever, and I don't really have much to say about it other than that. But yeah, Pink Floyd's The Wall, the best album from 1979. Potentially the best album ever for me. There it is. Dig it. Come back and join me in 1980. Let's see what's going on in 1980. Drop your comments down below and let me know what you think about some of these albums or my choice, and let me know what you think I'll pick in 1980. I got a few comments that said I surprised everybody with Jerry Rafferty last year, so I don't think this one will be a huge surprise. Maybe it will. I don't know. But anyway, there you go. The Wall.